So, I think we're going to want to take your perspective on things as someone from Canada. I think it's a very good part of this, actually, and I'll tie that together. But, to sort of frame the conversation for the industry, let's make sure, why don't you level set and tell people, what actually does Herjavec do so they kind of understand where you fit in the ecosystem?
Yeah, so thank you. All joking aside, I've been in the security business for a really long time. So one of the first people to sell a product called Checkpoint way back in the 90s. And so had that company, had another company that created VPN appliances and stuff. And then we started the Herjavec Group in 2003 or 4 with the idea to sell managed services, and the market wasn't quite there. But it took us a long time to get going. And today, we're a global company. We'll do about $200 million this year. We have over 300 people, and we operate 4 SOCs around the world: Toronto, Ottawa, big facilities, LA, we have a pretty big facility, and in London in the UK. And so what we specialize in is in large, complex, multi-vendor environments. And we're very good at taking in massive amounts of logs and alerts and adding context and analytics around it. Mm-hmm. And so it's been really interesting in the last few years what we've seen in terms of cloud and adoption from a customer perspective. I think the biggest thing that we've seen is the executive focus on security at the board level and at the executive level that we never saw before.
So let's drill down on that a little bit, because that's something that I think a lot of people here sort of struggle to get that seat at the table. Maybe if they're an industry that's highly regulated, information security risk management's got to be addressed there. But what are you seeing? How do people do it right? How do they do it wrong? And how are they getting that seat at the table with boards?
I always say I've been doing the same thing for 30 years and nobody cared. Mm-hmm. I'd be the guy in the corner at a party, and people say, "What do you do?" And I go, "I'm in computer security." And say, "What's that?" And I try to explain it, and they didn't care, and then tell me they just bought this software and how does it work on their computer. And I'm like, I really don't know. And people are like, "Oh, he's an idiot." And about 5 years ago, there was a big shift where executives began to care about security because of the target breaches and the big exposures. In the last couple of years, that became more of a board discussion. It's very rare that we have a customer now that doesn't have somebody on the board with cybersecurity responsibility. And so that's really different. And that's just in the last couple of years. And there's a big gap now that we see. It's almost a dual strategy. Most of the boards want a cyber strategy from a cost saving and compliance perspective and business continuity. And the technical people want cybersecurity from making it better, having the right solutions, and so on. And so we're seeing that there's certainly more money being put at it, and people are aware of it more, but it's still a big difference between the technical group and the executive group as to what the outcome is. And we see this a lot in breaches. We've been involved in a lot of high-profile breaches, and when there's a breach, the legal compliance people really want to know why it happened. Mm-hmm. Who was responsible? What technologies? Was it something we could have prevented? And a lot of the questions come from an audit, compliance, and legal perspective in case there's a lawsuit.
Right.
Because there's a big focus on, did you do enough in your company to do security with everything you knew?
Right.
But then there's the business side who doesn't care why the breach happened and just wants to get back to work.
Right. But isn't this like about the hardest thing to go sell to a board? Because you're talking about success being the presence of nothing, and then obviously understanding how boards will want to have accountability if there's a breach. But when an organization seems to not have a breach and maybe they're spending a lot of money on information security, it gets hard to say, hey, was that a consequence of us spending a lot of money on information security or spending this amount? Or could we correlate that with the crazy person that's on the corner making noises to themselves, which it's hard to prove a negative. So how do we do that in a way to communicate the right sort of metrics and get boards to believe this? It seems like it's an uphill battle.
Jim, I think we're hot now. I think that security has gone from the ugly cousin you had to take to the dance because you couldn't get a date to the hot Playboy model. And I don't think the problem is getting people to talk about security at the board level, because even board members who don't know a lot about security want to come across as though they do. It's cool. It's cool to know security. And I'm sure you guys see that too. When you go to a party now and people go, "What do you do?" And you say, "Oh, I'm in, cybersecurity." And all of a sudden people care. They want to know more about it. They really don't, but they want to, they want to come across like they do. But the difference is how we package that information. The challenge in our industry, the good of our industry is extreme innovation. There's constantly new technologies, new niches, new things to help us. And the bane of our existence is constant innovation. What's difficult at the board level is having spent $3 million on a technology 2 years ago, and then coming along today and saying, "Nah, yeah, we're not going to renew that." That investment, because executives always think of return on investment. So if I spent $1, why am I throwing that dollar out now? And I think the real challenge is, do you always need the absolute best of breed, or is 98% good enough in some solutions good enough if it integrates with the core application?
So talk through a little bit more about that, retaining the investment. And we had a presentation earlier before you got here about DevSecOps, and sort of the premise was, you're doing it all wrong. We're going to have to think really differently about information security and do things in a much more agile way. And we've seen it in the industry where a company becomes a very big information security company, and then they miss the next wave. And I mean, even this goes to a lot of your entrepreneurial pursuits as well. And so, what do you think about that? And do we have our eye on the ball on the right technology, the right types of solutions? Are we spending money in the right ways?
Well, first of all, I would never tell the people in this room they're doing it all wrong, because I'm trying to sell stuff to them. So you're all wonderful. From a technology perspective, what's great about our world is I find we go through these waves. Every 3 years, there's something fundamentally new. And I love that about it. I mean, if you don't like constant change, you probably shouldn't be in cybersecurity.
Yep.
Right? But I always think 3 years ago when we were here, endpoint was dead. It was like nobody talked about the endpoint. And then last year, it was all about the endpoint. Everybody had an endpoint agent. The trend that we're seeing this year is a lot of identity. I really believe as the perimeter's fallen, and we just talked about this at another session, what is the perimeter today? How do you define the perimeter? It used to be really easy. It was your egress points where you put a bunch of firewalls and things. But today, what is your perimeter when everybody's accessing from cloud and personal devices? So I think we're seeing a lot of growth in identity, access management, network access. Those are all really hot technologies. And scanning and vulnerability. And then, the third area where we're seeing a big trend is in software development scans. We have certain techniques. At the end of the day, for most enterprises, it's the software that runs the core business. And you really want to make sure that all of that is put together and secure and safe.
Right. Sounds like he was actually here earlier. That's very.
Were you talking about that earlier?
Yeah, we talked about it. So it is good that this is sort of resonating. Another thing we talked about, and I'd like to get your take on it, is IoT, Internet of Things, and I sort of liken it to, Moore's Law and tech consumerization. It means huge cloud data centers on the one side, and then just a computer chip everywhere, IoT. And that just seems like that's scaling way farther than the human population is going to grow, number of information security professionals. So, and we've had things like the dying DDoS attack with the video cameras or whatever it is. But what are you seeing on that, and what do you think from IoT?
I think it's an exciting time to be in our industry because of the pace of change. And, I think that if the internet were a child, it's only beginning to learn to crawl. I mean, in my mind, that's how early we are in the stage of things. And great technology truly becomes fundamental to us when it becomes ubiquitous. The internet is still not ubiquitous. We still go to a Starbucks and log on. We still go somewhere. But I think we're entering a phase very quickly where the internet will become the phase of electricity.
Yep.
And it just will be. And the only time people will notice it is when it's not on. No one's going to leave tonight and go home and say, oh, there was that guy from Shark Tank, and he was okay. But, you know, when I walked into the room, we had 4 bars of light. And, you know, they turned them on, and it came on, and it was great. And I think that's the phase that we're going through. And whatever the device is that's connecting us, it's really access to information. The average enterprise user will expect to be able to access information 24 hours a day, 7 days a week from any device, anywhere. And I think that's really challenging from a security perspective.
So you mentioned this sort of becoming a utility, and yeah, that's, I think we definitely agree. You know, cloud is a way of compute not being the hardware you buy so much as it's this service, you just provision it and it's there, and it's global. So what's maybe the perspective? So when you and Kevin and maybe a few other Canadians get together, what's the perspective on all these American cloud providers, and are they trustworthy outside of the U.S.? And
you know, it's a very interesting perspective, and I'll tell you, I was wrong on this. So our company started in Canada, as I said, and we really wanted to expand because we're growing so quickly around the world. When we entered the U.S. market, we didn't think we needed to build a U.S. SOC because it's very expensive to build facilities and infrastructure. And I felt if I went to customers and explained to them, you know, what the cloud was, and that we're looking at the metadata and all this other stuff, people would say, no, I get it. But every customer said to me, well, do you have a SOC in the US? And I said, but you know, no, it doesn't really matter because your data is here, and if you're using this cloud provider, the data may be somewhere else. And people were like, oh, that's very interesting, but do you have a US SOC? And so we should have built one sooner, frankly, because it was such a perceived objection to people. Now, some countries like the UK, there's actual privacy compliance reasons for the data to be there. In Canada, we have a healthcare regulation where we can't use US-based cloud providers. So AWS just launched a Canadian cloud service. And so I don't know if it's a regulatory as much as it is perceived, but here's my prediction, I'm already seeing this, there's going to be more and more compliance in our area. The big driver in security in the next 2 to 3 years is actually not going to be breaches, because I think we've become a little desensitized to breaches. I think boards, you know, you run in and go, oh my God, Target's been breached. Oh my God, Sony's been. Like, at what point does the executive say, yeah, I've heard this before, but hey, there's a new compliance law that forces us to do this. People really care about that stuff. You know, I think fundamentally we are being driven by an industry where people at a business level don't really wake up and say, how can I spend millions of dollars on security? Gosh, I don't know what I'm going to do today, but let me go buy more Palo Alto. Yeah. But they are definitely driven by compliance. And so I think you're going to see more regulation and more in-country cloud services.
Seems though it's a little bit of a contradiction when we have a global compute utility, but yet every country wants to regulate it differently.
Yeah, very much.
So how many of you in the audience, by show of hands, think you spend enough on compliance? How many think you spend too much on compliance? It's about the same. So compliance, sometimes it's not, it takes away from the fun stuff, the fun and sexy stuff, I know, but I think you're absolutely right. That's just where we're going to see a huge amount of growth.
You know, well, I always think you can only, people only spend a certain amount of money based on fear. But they spend an incredible amount of money to gain revenue or make their business better. And I think when you sell out of fear, you're going to hit a wall. But when you sell from a business betterment, compliance, having to stay in business and be competitive, you have much more length in that business.
Right. So, what are some other things that you think we should be looking, besides compliance, that we should be looking, this audience should be thinking about, that they should have on their radar for the next year or two? And one thing we heard earlier was loud and clear is that ransomware is just growing exponentially. It's growing crazy. And we talked a little bit about the IoT sorts of things. That's going to be something to think about. But I mean, it could be anything, threat or just risk management, compliance. Are there other things that this group should be thinking about and preparing for?
I think there's very few technologies that we are going to care about that aren't going to be available in a cloud model. I think the consumption model in security is on the verge of changing forever, and most technologies have, but it will change forever. And so that's good. The good is we get to buy really sophisticated, complex technology in bite-sized chunks. The bad is we're going to pay for it forever. In the old world, we paid more up front, but we got to this point where we kind of stopped paying on a per user basis. And so I think everything's going to move to the cloud. Everything's going to be available there. Scanning tools by most vendors have been available there. Identity's been available there. I think most vendors will offer that solution. But that's the big thing that we see is the growth of identity. It's an extremely complicated space to be in. And it's one of those technologies that once you put it in, it requires a lot of care and feeding.
Right.
There's some technologies you put in, typically like a firewall or IPS required a lot of hand-holding, but certain devices where you could tune them and make them better, but you didn't need care and feeding every day. Identity is a lot of care and feeding.
Yeah. I mean, we have to think about identity of not only people, but every device, every virtual machine, every data store application. Really doesn't, everything that has an IP address needs to have an identity.
And not to be self-serving or sell anybody, but the fastest growing segment in the security industry is actually managed security. And this is from a Royal Bank capital markets study. And it's not just managed services. There's two unique things about that space. It's the fastest growing segment, and it's the most fragmented. So if you take every other space, antivirus endpoint, and you take the top 2 or 3 market leaders, you typically get above a 35% market share. In managed security, you take the top 8, and I think you get to 12% market share. So it's a very fragmented business. And what's making it even more challenging is you have non-traditional people entering the space who feel cybersecurity helps their core business. So people like defense contractors, people like large-scale integrators, all want to be in the cybersecurity space because as they're selling their technologies to customers, whether it be airplanes or tanks or big software, customers are saying, what do you guys know about cybersecurity? So it may be a relatively small dollar amount to them, but it's driving a massive amount of revenue. I was at a dinner party and I saw Steven Schwartzman from Blackstone. And Blackstone bought a big security company. And so I went up to him and I was talking to him about it. And I said, oh, what do you know about cybersecurity? And he goes, honestly, I don't get briefed. I don't know a lot about it. But here's what I know about cybersecurity. Tomorrow's defense contractor is today's cybersecurity company.
Really?
And so I found that very, very interesting. And that's another trend is the growth of militarized attacks and governments within that sector.
Yeah, I mean, major governments, they're all weaponizing. It's not all about defense anymore, it's about offense. Do you think the private sector, are we ever going to be getting into the offense? I mean, they've called it active defense where, you hack back, or is that just going to be too perilous for the private sector to go hack their adversaries?
Well, I think we're going to send out nasty tweets if somebody tweets against us. Because, no, I think that creates a whole nother adversarial, legal, compliant, blah, blah, blah issues. But, it's like espionage. I'm sure there's a lot of espionage goes on at the corporate level from document handling and research and stuff like that, but I don't think we're going to see companies have a strategy of going after somebody in that area.
Right, okay. So I think we might have time for a question from the audience before we bring the enterprises up, but I did want to just sort of follow up. So, I mean, you started really early in managed services, and probably you're selling a lot more boxes before that had
We were,
about.
I mean, I could talk about this forever. I love this industry, but my original vision, to be completely frank with you, in 2003, the average enterprise in 2003 had 13 security technologies. And I thought that was incredibly complicated and people couldn't keep up. So the vision was that we would monitor firewalls, IPS, and these other devices. Turned out we were way, way too soon. The tipping point in the managed services space was really a SIM. You know, and one of the first was network intelligence, was required by RSA, became the Envision product line. But if you think about it, before that, you couldn't centralize logs. You know, if something happened or there's a breach, you'd have to go to every device. And so that was really the beginning of the growth of that industry, and it just continues to get even more complicated and complex.
It's amazing the versatility you have and how deep you're able to go in these different areas, Robert, while still being this entrepreneur and running the company. Guys, I tried to soften them up for you, but I don't think.
You know, I have a question for the audience. I'm curious, Jim, and see what you think. One of the areas that's become interesting to us, and I say interesting because I'm not sure where it's going or how it's going to necessarily affect the average enterprise, is this whole deep dark web. We had one of our customers had a pretty big breach last year, and it was discovered with some stuff being sold on the deep dark web. And I really thought that people would really want to know more about their presence and threat feeds around that area. And I'm not seeing a lot of customers really take up that interest. Are you seeing that?
Oh, I think it's probably more for the early adopters who really get that, who see that's just the next wave of something that's going to be easier to monetize and weaponize. But the dark web side is going to clearly grow, and it's related a lot to the IoT stuff too. You think about all these devices that go into someone's home and are listening and doing all these things.
Right.
There's a lot of information that's not just going to be stolen, it's going to be freely given up and gathered, but it's not going to be stored on these same search engines. So I think it's a matter of that, again, being something, you need that seminal event that sort of resonates with the traditional consciousness there, and then I think that's going to be a big deal.
But I thought the Panama Papers, the leak and the sale of them would really be that. But you're right, I think it's an early adopter issue, but I was just curious to see what you think about that.
But it's imminent. It's one of the next things, and that's where we got to be. We can't be looking at solving, basing our security strategy on the last hack that happened, but on where it's going, and that's clearly an area where it's going. So, well, I've really enjoyed this, Robert. This has been really good for me. I've learned a lot here, and the panelists, they don't seem to be shaking. None of them have left. So,
that one lady left in the front.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to chase her down and say, what the hell?
Okay.
In the middle of my talk, you walked out.
Maybe it was
in defense, you were talking.
Oh, okay. It could have been my cousin that I dated. So, that's right. We don't have a family tree. It's just a trunk. So, what we're going to do here is I'm going to introduce and bring up Vinay Patel, Global Head of Information Security for City Enterprise Infrastructure. Joe Zacharias, Head of Information Security Engineering, Enterprise Security Risk Management for Global Information Services at Caterpillar. Marissa Ruffalo, Cybersecurity Enterprise Architect at Chevron. And Jerry Archer, board member of CSA, but also SVP and Chief Security Officer for Sallie Mae. So folks, come on up and get your comeuppance from the shark. So thanks, guys.
Thank you. I think you're all the way down. Vinay. Oh,
Hi, guys.
we'll let Jerry sit there. Okay.
Make sure you're entertaining, because that lady walked out when Jim was speaking. So don't blow it here. All right. So, all right. Is it Vinay?
Vinay.
Vinay. So I'm just going to go in random. Vinay, tell us a little bit about yourself and what do you do at Citi?
Okay, great. So Vinay Patel, been with Citi for about 13 years. I head up information security for their enterprise operation technology division, which is pretty large in terms of infrastructure technology, shared services, operations, real estate. In addition to that, I'm also involved with the Cloud Security Alliance. I'm the chair of their enterprise advisory board.
All right. And what's the biggest issue that you're seeing? If you look back a year ago and today, what's the biggest change in focus, or would you say it's revolutionary, or are you tweaking things?
I think if you mean from a enterprise point of view,
Yeah.
Certainly it's beginning to really take the steps necessary towards the overall technology strategy for, as you've heard many speakers say, for large, sophisticated companies with significant scale already, cloud isn't what it is to a small and medium business enterprise, as an example. But it does provide a complementary capability that needs to be valued on a case-by-case basis. So we're really refining, what are the right use cases for us as an enterprise when we think about cloud, both internally. One of the things I'll mention maybe in our discussion is when we talk about cloud, all we just say is when we move to the cloud. But cloud isn't a thing, right? So there is equally the on-prem capability of cloud that organizations can have, as well as hybrid and public. So I think it's just refining what that vision and strategy looks like.
Joseph?
Joe Zacharias? Yeah,
You're with Caterpillar. I have an important question for you.
go for it.
How big are the tires on the
Which tire?
big truck? What's the biggest tire on a Caterpillar?
So a 797 mining truck, I believe it's about 16 feet
16.
in diameter. Yeah.
And how much does a tire like that cost?
I believe that they're right around 100,000 each, somewhere around there.
Wow. Did they ever let you drive the trucks?
They do not. They do not.
All right. So tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, so Joe Zacharias, I lead our information security engineering team. We're responsible for all of the security architecture and operations at Caterpillar, inclusive of now our connected asset security program. So we just launched a strategic initiative last year, received funding this year. I was one of those few people that raised their hand around IoT funding. But our connected assets are mining trucks and our excavators, connected gensets, all of those things that we have are now going to develop programs around security for those systems and devices.
It's interesting, somebody on another panel asked me if I'm seeing IoT adoption at the enterprise level, and I said it's still more of a consumer play, except in certain sectors where assets are being connected. And we have a lot of mining customers, and there's a lot of devices being connected along that line.
Oh yeah, we've been doing autonomous mining for about 10 years now. So self-driving vehicles in Australia, 30 machines, 30 mining trucks, 200 tons, driving on a road, on a track, and basically dumping or loading autonomously. 30% more efficient than a manned mine that you would find down there. So Caterpillar's been doing it a long time. The challenge now is kind of where we're going in terms of connecting all of these devices to cloud services. And when you're in a remote mine site, much different than being right on Highway 101 here in California, right? There's a different attack vector and different attack surface that you see. So our ability to expand security to those devices that are now going to get connected into those environments is going to be even more important because we don't have that remoteness of these sites anymore.
Jerry, tell us a little bit about Sallie Mae and
Sure.
your role there.
I'm the Chief Security Officer for Sallie Mae, so we have a converged security program. We do both physical, logical security, cybersecurity, all in one organization.
You do the physical and the cyber under one?
We do both. So one of the advantages of building a converged organization is we take advantage of the physical security guys who typically understand and know what it takes to prosecute a case. Meaning that if we have an incident or an issue, we have people who fully understand how to go through an investigative process, preserve evidence, keep track of the things that we'll need in case we want to prosecute from a law enforcement perspective, but more importantly, simply be able to draw a thread through the process that's very efficient because they typically have done that a lot more than, say, the cyber guys have. And so that's one of the things that we did in building a converged organization. The other part of that is simply combining scarce assets. So security people are hard to find, despite the fact that we have so many in this room. They're all very gainfully employed, so hiring security professionals is a challenge. So one of the things that we tended to do was, by aggregating everything security in one team, we're able to take and leverage that team more effectively across the organization. So we take advantage of that scale.
Have you found that, because obviously you're in a more regulated industry, have you found that insider breaches or data is on the rise for you? Is it?
For us, it hasn't been a problem, meaning that we do a lot of vetting because of regulatory requirements in the financial services industry. Everyone goes through background checks before they're hired. Anybody in a position of trust can have committed a crime of breach of trust. So a lot of the things that you might say encounter in other areas, we don't, because we vet people fairly strongly before they come in the door. But to the other side of the coin, one of the biggest initiatives we're undertaking this year is endpoint behavioral analysis. So it's not so much that we're worried about the actual individual, it's that the fact the individual has been compromised in some way, meaning he's got malware or something to that effect where someone's impersonating that individual. So we're focused very heavily this year, and I think that's probably the next big trend that we see, is this behavioral analysis part.
Is there more pushback at your executive level because of cloud services? Is there more of a perception that it's not as secure, or are they more educated today?
Well, we're fortunate. Sallie Mae was a GSE for a long time, became a private company, and then 2.5 years ago we separated. We became Sallie Mae Bank, and then there was a whole nother component of Sallie Mae that became Navient. We had a greenfield opportunity, so I didn't carry any of the legacy over with me, so we rebuilt security. Now I get the privilege of going to the board of directors 7 times a year to brief them.
Wow.
So they're very in tune to cybersecurity.
That's a lot. Yeah.
Way too much.
So Marissa, you're with Chevron.
Yes.
Very important question. Oil prices going up or down?
Well, we see them eventually going up.
Wow, that is such a corporate line.
At least we're hoping they'll be going up. Basically, I think we heard analysts say 50 to 70, but it's hard to know. 50 to 70 a barrel, yeah.
Wow.
That's good.
Tell us a bit about your environment and what
So-
keeps you up at night.
So I'm the enterprise architect at Chevron specifically for cybersecurity, meaning that I work through the 5 different pillars of security. We have application security, data protection, network security, identity and access management, and threat protection. We consider our 5 pillars. And I think the concern about cloud specifically, we have a lot of people that are working on various aspects of cloud, but trying to take a more cohesive approach has been difficult because you have the application owners wanting to go to cloud right away. You can't do it soon enough. And then you have the infrastructure folks and especially the security folks in our cyber intelligence center saying, well, let's take a step back and make sure that we can have the same level of security we have today on premises. However, what we're finding is that you're never going to have the same visibility and control that you have on premises because you are relying on the infrastructure provided by a cloud provider. So there's some give and take there.
What's the craziest way somebody in your company has ever thought of the cloud?
Let's see here. Well, I've had people compare it to, we were actually in a cloud seminar last week where someone compared it to a hotel. So basically, you think of the cloud as having different rooms, and then you're actually subletting a room in a hotel, and you're subletting your network infrastructure, or whatever you might be in the cloud. So that's an interesting analogy that came up last week.
What's the biggest threat that you think looking into 2017? Is it identity? Is it malware?
So we're seeing a lot, well, there's a lot more talk about ransomware, malware. We're thinking about more protection on the endpoint side, but we really see identity as the new perimeter, so we're spending a lot of focus there. So we're thinking we need to move away from that traditional castle moat model and move more towards identity as the center.
Vinay, would you agree? Are you guys seeing a lot of identity, or is it not quite on the horizon? If you are you seeing it as a cloud or an on-prem?
I think the focus on identity is correct from an industry point of view. I think broadly speaking, I think if I go back to your original question, I think it's the change in 2017 is the convergence of all the different threat vectors coming together. Malware doesn't happen for the sake of malware. It comes with a purpose. It's now a tool of some type of adversary, organized crime, nation state, whatever the case may be. So I think really it's bringing together threat intelligence with your existing capability. You mentioned taking alerts and enriching them with the right context, threat intelligence being one of them, but also at the same time collaboration between industry peers, government, public, private sector, et cetera. I think that's really the key that's going to be important in terms of how we defend against today's threats and how they're evolving. Right.
Joseph?
For us, it's a host of things. Identities is definitely one of them. I think it's foundational to some of the things that we're trying to do with cloud, both machine and user. And I think there was a couple of talks earlier that described it as such as well. The endpoint too is changing. It's not just your 5-pound laptop. It's your 90-ton excavator or your 200-ton mining truck or a gen set. And I might upset a few electrical engineers in here, but to me, it's just another endpoint that I have to secure. It's connected to something, either a cloud service or an infrastructure component, and then there is some sort of control or monitoring capability with that that's ingesting that data or consuming that data in some way, and you have some application that a user is interfacing with. So from that standpoint, it's really about looking at the entire ecosystem. If I secure that device really well, then I'll just move up the stack if I want to attack it. I'll hit the network, or I'll hit the cloud service, or I'll hit the application directly. So those are the areas that we're really looking at, is around the network, the endpoint, identities.
We had a guy on the show on Shark Tank one year, and his entire business premise was he took used dump trucks and he would buy a piece of land, and it was mainly guys that would go, and you get to play with a dumpster. So you'd pay per hour and you get to move around these construction things. And I was like, that is so stupid. I'm not really a dumpster driving kind of guy. And
if you guys want to check it out, there's an entire YouTube channel, I think, on it.
So that's what the guy said. He said people are fanatical about this. There's a whole YouTube thing, and it's a thing. But Jerry, biggest risks and threats that you guys see?
Yeah, I think the biggest risk that I see is what we don't know, the horizon risk. It's trying to surf the wave rather than being drowned by the wave. Every single day, something's different. I used to tell people that I wake up every morning and I'm like a recovering drug addict. I just hope to make it through one more day, right? Who knew that ransomware was going to be the biggest thing this year? And before that, it was some malware, and before that, it was phishing, and before that, it was something else. Everything in our profession is changing every single day. And how do you defend against something that you don't know what it is? We don't know what's going to happen next month. There's not a person in this room that could predict for me how we will be attacked, what the vector will be, what the threat plane will look like, what our new products and features are. We don't know. The Internet of Things is the tip of the iceberg. It's the beginning. To your point earlier, we're just in the infancy of this whole thing. So what are we going to do? How do we start to predict that, and how do we analyze it? How do we build organizations that can react in a timely way? Where does the expertise come from? How do we educate? All of those things are pressing problems, and that's what I worry about every day. That's the problem that we have. It's everything.
Marissa, do you see more government intervention and focus, or do you think that you're going to see more government guideline?
Yeah, I think it'll be more guideline. There was a panel, I think it was mentioned earlier. There was a presidential commission last year that actually interviewed, the Presidential Commission for Enhanced National Cybersecurity. And they interviewed members of actually the oil and natural gas industry, as well as the utility industry and a few others, asking us what we thought about regulation. And the response from that panel was basically, it's difficult to regulate the security in general, because the changes that are happening are so quick and so dynamic that it's hard to develop a regulation and actually have it stick. So I see it be more guidance. And then the commission actually provided a set of recommendations. I think there are 16 recommendations in the document that was developed and was published in December. And most of that discussed public-private partnerships more so government partnering with industry on subjects such as identity and access management, on Internet of Things, and providing standards and guidance versus true regulation.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because I think that I remember the first time the president used the word cybersecurity was about 4 years ago in a State of the Union attack, and it was at the end of the speech, and he mentioned, I forget for what reason, and I was so excited because I was like, you know, it's the new golden age in our industry, but it's that sharing of data, you know, and how many industries, even in the same field, are that open to sharing data. But, you know, I think we're definitely going to see more regulation coming down than less.
Well, when you mentioned the data sharing, so I think in the financial sector you have the financial ISAC. Yeah, and we actually just started an ONG ISAC for data sharing. So what we're hoping is that through the data sharing we're able to somewhat prove to government entities that we can share, take care of our own, and actually share with them as well to provide information to other sectors.
I think some of those ISACs are getting more mature as well. If you look at the auto ISAC, it was hardly anything a few years ago, and now they're really putting some emphasis around how we do cybersecurity around automotive vehicles and connected devices.
Yeah, I think we're trying to promote it more as a partnership with the government versus the government dictating to industry what needs to be done.
Yeah, I think
That's
it's a good
the hope.
point. I'm sorry, Jim and I had the opportunity to go brief the FFIEC. I think we could say that, can't we, Jim? And one of the things that we did is I think the regulation is evolving. Our regulators are evolving. It's more about a partnership. So I think you'll see in financial services, you want to build this ongoing relationship with your regulators to help them understand what you're doing and how you're evolving. And I think that they're interested now. It's not about regulation. It's not about writing it down on a piece of paper. We stressed, or at least I did in the briefing of the FFIEC, we already have regulation that allows them to regulate the cloud. What we don't have is a full and complete understanding by the regulators what cloud is and how to make it safe, sound, and secure. That's the process that we have to go through. We have to educate our regulators. It's the next evolution of what a regulator is. He's a partner. He's no longer just an overseer, and I think that's the incredibly important part to get to the cloud, frankly.
Jim, I thought maybe we'd take some questions from the crowd, if anybody has any.
This is Srini. I work for a French investment bank. This is more of a question for you, Robert. As a CEO of a company, what keeps you awake?
Say again?
As a CEO of a company, what keeps you awake from a security standpoint?
As a CEO of a company, what keeps me up at night? Everything, all the time. I live in extreme fear and paranoia every day. It's true, you know, it's the old Andy Grove saying from a long time ago from his book, and says, only the paranoid survive. And I have a modern version of that quote, and I have to give credit to Mark Cuban on our show, because one time I said this quote, and I attributed it to me, and somebody knew him and called him, and then he called me, and he said, you're using my quote, and you're not giving me credit. So I have to give him credit. And so I have this saying on my desk in my office, and it says, every day somebody wakes up with the sole intention of kicking your ass. And so, you know, for me, it's always about how do we add more value to the business, and how do we compete in a highly fast-moving pace, where the pace of change is happening all the time. And I think that's one of the things that makes me relatable to a lot of our customers, because business people, that's what they think about. They think about the business. They don't really think about security. You know, we love what we do, but I find sometimes we live in a myopic world where we love what we do because it's what we do. But we all work for a business that's driven fundamentally by value creation, and I always have to change that hat when I'm dealing with people like that. And my dog keeps me up at night because she wants to go out in the middle of the night. I don't know why.
Thank you, Robert.
you.
Out of curiosity, you were speaking about the dark web. Do you have any future plans for having a dark web venture or any kind of a deep learning, setting up a deep learning bot in a dark web and probably build up some kind of a profiling company to keep a tap on the bad guys?
Yeah, do we have a venture or a fund? All I do is I go to work. I'm an incredibly boring guy that way, and people always think the TV show is a big part of what I do, and it's actually just an interesting stat. Shark Tank has been on the air for 8 years now. We're the highest bought show on network television. ABC buys 37 episodes, and on average, a network show is 12 episodes and takes 3.5 months to film. Our show is 37 episodes. We film it in 17 days. 8 days in June, 9 days in September. There's absolutely no preparation. We know nothing about the people that come out. I show up and I sit in the chair. And so I go to work every day doing this. It's really just a hobby for us. But we've thought about having people that are in our industry come on the show, but it doesn't work because what we do is pretty technical. We tried that in the first couple of seasons. We'd have security ventures come up or technical stuff, and it really doesn't work because we're not a business show. We're really entertainment that happens to be around business. So, any other questions?
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Oh, that's fine.
Just a quick question around private cloud for big corporations.
Great question.
So when we are trying to implement it internally, what's the biggest difference that I should take as a takeaway to compare, the data centers that we have today and the private cloud that's also inside, maybe using the same data centers? So what's the biggest security concern?
Well, I think in infrastructure as a service, which I think is what you're referring to, we have I would think you have similar infrastructure, but you're not controlling the lower layers. So you're not controlling the operating, or you're controlling the operating system, but nothing beneath that. So
I'm talking about PaaS also.
Okay, so
yeah,
in PaaS?
Yes.
I think that one of the major concerns is you don't necessarily have control, especially in PaaS, of the lower layers. So you're not able to get the same information back that you would. So you're not going through your own IPS, your own firewall. So a lot of the monitoring is no longer within your domain. So there's basically a lack of control. At least that's the way our cybersecurity folks internally look at it. They're losing control, they're losing visibility. So that's one of the issues you might have.
Yeah, I think when
Somebody clapped for you. Was that your husband? Did you make him come?
Might be a team member.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah, my team's here. Actually, they're sitting over there.
Is that why you made them come? All right, that's cool.
So just to add to what Marissa said, I think another way of looking at implementing a on-prem private cloud, especially to say infrastructure as a service, is actually one of the best ways to actually enhance your level of security in terms of any other technology you could purchase, right? And cloud is how you use the technology, not any specific piece of technology. And you've all heard about software-defined perimeter today. You've heard about software-defined networking. So the capabilities exist. I think the most important thing to consider is you're not going to benefit from running a private cloud and be more secure or less secure if you don't really think about the application, how they're architected to take the most advantage of that cloud. And that's both architecturally in terms of how the application functions and is developed, as well as how it's operated in terms of the DevOps models, et cetera. With all of those in mind, if it's architected and constructed the right way, you can do things like micro-segmentation. You can get all the visibility you want. You can actually dynamically enhance the level of security. You can get better behavioral analysis out of an application and the flows of data. So I think it's one of the best ways, but there is a lot of thought that has to go into it. The right teams need to be talking about it up front. It shouldn't be viewed as just a cost driver purely. And I think when you look at it doing that way, it's essentially nothing more than a little bit more sophisticated version of automated virtualization. So.
Thank you.
So for Caterpillar, we actually looked at private cloud for a little while and did the cost analysis, and it just didn't work out. We're trying to get out of the data center business, right? That's not what we do. So we're moving. And I have no one on my team here.
No, it's a guy who works for a data center company.
So what we're trying to do is move to colo and public cloud. So wherever we can, we're going to migrate our data centers out of our traditional environments and down into colos, and then eventually to public cloud, and look at extending the capabilities of using shared infrastructure and shared utilities, right? We know and we realize that there has to be some security around all of those capabilities, but we're trying to think strategically about where our business is going in the future and how all of these services that are being offered by SaaS and platform and infrastructure are eventually going to be a lot like utility grids, right? It's out there. I need to basically get some compute and storage, but I need to figure out how to secure those capabilities.
Yeah, the only difference is that when it comes to heavily regulated financial industry,
Absolutely.
then internal becomes a better option than going,
Yes.
for public.
Yeah, we have a much different business.
Yeah.
So, okay, you ready for this? We don't own a data center. Wait a minute, where's the clap?
Thank you.
So, as I said earlier, the greenfield opportunity for us when we separated the two companies, we essentially run a private cloud as a hosted facility. So we have a private cloud that is run by a separate company for us. We don't own any hardware, we don't own any servers. The only hardware that we actually own is mostly security stuff that we keep in a colo, but everything else is run as a separate sort of private cloud for us, and we're beginning to move into the public cloud. The biggest security risk that we typically face is, I would tell you, it's in contracts. It's being able to structure a contract in such a way that you're balancing risk versus transparency. So the assumption of risk versus the transparency you have into the provider. And that that balance is the hard thing to achieve, both contractually and then ongoing, to make sure that your vendor or your private cloud is producing the kind of metrics that you can rely on to talk about security. So
That's one of the trends we're seeing less and less over the last 2 years. I heard a lot of talk about private cloud, and now I hear a lot of talk about segmentation within a public cloud.
Right.
And so I think you're right. I think I think the idea of building except for compliance and regulation in certain areas, which may change, but the cost benefits of public cloud are massive and irreplaceable. Yes, sir.
So you talked about regulatory and how you expect regulatory to go, I guess laws to increase. The demand today, it seems like the IT shop gets stretched more and more by regulatory and audit findings, whether it's in identity where you're constantly being questioned about applications that you're managing, vendor relationships. You used to be an IT person, you just dealt with the vendor and never had to do anything else. Now you have all kinds of paperwork and evidence of what you're doing for the vendor these days. So how do you see, I know you mentioned FFIEC from the financials perspective, but as leaders, what can you do to start consolidating and streamlining compliance and regulatory? I mean, to me, that's one of those things everybody deals with, and is the higher you go up, you just take it as an inevitability, but the people below you are struggling and swimming and trying to keep their head above all that.
yeah, one of the things that we did when I first came to Sallie Mae is we looked at our security budget and how the money was being spent. About 75 to 80% of our budget was spent on compliance. So the first thing that had to change was we had to get out of the business of compliance. Our strategy was to aggregate, we talked about that. The next thing that we did was automate. We did everything that we could to automate compliance. We'd like to automate compliance out of business, if you will, to some degree. So we deployed a GRC system. We take every one of our controls. We have complete traceability to every regulation that drives that control. We automate the evidence collection. We automate the repetitiveness of compliance. And to be honest with you, true story, I gave to our regulators who showed up for a bank examination, we gave them training on our GRC system. We let them have limited access to our GRC system. And in fact, I told them that if they wanted to, they could give us their letterhead. They could go back to Washington, D.C., and we could just print their audit reports for them and mail them. But we haven't got quite that far yet. But the idea is again, the bar for it is essential. It is absolutely essential to have compliance. We have to set a bar. We have the world's greatest financial system in this country that's ever been created by mankind. The worst thing that we could do is get to a point where we believe that technology is driving us to a point where we take enormous risk with that system. We shouldn't do that. So there has to be a bar set that we all live to. But beyond that, then there's much more to be really secure, right? Compliance gets us to a minimal level, then we're more secure. But I think the automation part was that really drove us to a good place to give us, and by the way, today, the ratio we spend is somewhere around 50% of our budget on compliance and 50% on chasing bad guys.
Would you say that's common, the 50 to 50 ratio?
Well, I would tell you
high?
that I don't know, I mean, Citi can answer for Citi, but if I talk to a lot of my peers across the financial services industry, they're still in the 60 to 75 to 85% category for compliance.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really also depends on what you define as compliance or compliance-related activities as well, right? So, I mean, I think one of the important things to understand, and going back to the original question a little bit, I think part of the challenge is interpreting the regulations or guidelines. You know, a lot of these things, and I think part of the reason for the discussions that you were talking about was to educate the regulators a bit more. Where is the technology going? Where's the industry going? What are the adoptions like? What are the risk appetites like? And then I think, you know, any industry participant, whether it be energy, healthcare, financial, doesn't need necessarily just a set of regulations to tell them how important security is and on the use of new technology, because it's core to our business model, right? So I think it's upon us, frankly, to understand those risks and articulate well how best to control those, work with our partners in the ecosystem of cloud, whether it be a CSP, a number of solution providers, et cetera. And again, that collaboration amongst industries, whether it's, you know, information sharing groups or what have you, to then say, okay, this is almost a common minimum baseline we will all adopt regardless of regulation or not. And I think that's probably the best way to, you know, I think when you approach security from a compliance point of view, you're always going to do just the minimum or focus on spending too much on just demonstrating the minimum. Where you solve for the risk, you know, compliance becomes almost a, you know, just as a side effect.
Yes, sir.
There was some discussion earlier about bridging the gap between the board and executives and the security organization. I'd like to hear about bridging another gap that many organizations have, which is between the information technology and operational technology sides, and, you know, and what you're doing to get ahead of ransomware that, instead of holding your data hostage, holds your physical assets hostage.
So we have a process control assurance team that sets standards corporate-wide for process control. They partner with the information technology architecture teams as well. So we do feel that there does need to be a partnership, which is somewhat of a change in that paradigm, in that relationship. What we're concerned about now from a cloud perspective is that more and more we're getting vendors approach us that want to enable our instrumentation and connect those over wireless networks to the cloud, and then you're able to control from the cloud, send commands to your instrumentation from the cloud, as well as obtain data from data historians. We're really trying to take a step back before we allow that to be done in our environment, because we want to make sure we have a grasp of what industrial Internet of Things security should be. There aren't really many standards in this space, so we want to make sure that we have a full understanding of what specific devices we would be enabling to do that, and perhaps we're enabling a device certification or creating standards for implementing device certification, at least in our Chevron environment, before allowing them to enable that type of cloud access.
So she's talking about us, because we want to connect our devices in Chevron's environment. And rightfully so, she's asking the right questions, and as is a lot of our customers, they're coming to us and saying, okay, you want to connect your genset within a control system. what is the security around that? So now we're getting asked for SOC 2 Type 2 reports and compliance around our connected devices. Because you don't want to just be able to start and stop a genset in a utility grid from your iPad without knowing all of the controls in there. So that's the work that we're working on right now to show compliance with the requirements that a Chevron or another company would provide, so that we can give them that assurance. And then we do the same thing for our environments as well. So when you look at a shop floor or a production floor, normally we would just firewall them off, and that's what we do, right? We have a factory firewall, so we don't know a whole lot that goes on beyond there. They're not allowed to connect through to the business network or out to the internet, but now we're getting more and more requests for that. So we're going back to them and saying, okay, what are your controls when you're setting up an internet, cloud-connected robotic system that's building some production devices on our floor?
And I think because of the safety risks in our environment, so our control systems are refineries, pipelines, drilling platforms, so we're concerned about the safety risks as well, the cyber-physical element. And we only allow data out, we don't allow data in. So our firewalls are set up like a diode, just outbound data. But now with the cloud, again, that thinking would need to change. So that's why we're trying to take that slowly because of the risks involved.
So fascinating when you think about, like you said, the industrial Internet of Things. And I've actually never thought of it that way, but you're right. As you connect, you can get the data the other way. I think we're always thinking of access of data, but as you attach the controls, like we saw in traditional utilities, same security issues and risks coming along.
Absolutely.
I want to thank everybody on our panel, and I know everybody in this room loves security. I love being in this business because it just makes me feel like we're doing real good and tangible work, and I know that's a little melodramatic in that, but I really believe that. I really believe that what we do helps the world and makes the world a better place, and there's going to be a lot of change in technology. And my final comment is, you'll appreciate this, in the weirdest thing I've ever seen on Shark Tank. Talk about technology. In our first season, this guy comes out and he had a telephone that was implanted under your skin. And it sounds a little crazy at first, but the more he talked, he seemed normal. And and I don't know whether we were tired or he just was normal. He was talking about it, and you kind of think, yeah, that would be kind of cool. I'm going to need a device, just get implanted. And so Barbara says, you're an idiot or something. She goes, where would I get it implanted? And he goes, just in the base of your neck so that you could hear it. And then she was like, okay, and how would I get an upgrade? This is why you go in and you get surgery again for a different upgrade. And again, the more he talked, the more normal he sounded. And so we were all like, this is fascinating, until Damon asked him, how do I charge it? And he said, oh, it's a good question. And he flips this diagram, and he said, you would have a hole in your neck, and every night there'd be like this bar coming out of the wall, and every night you plug yourself in and charge yourself up for half an hour. We knew he wasn't normal then. But Barbara still invested. So, no, I'm joking. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Cheers.